After Greg Oden fractured his kneecap from simply jumping in a game in 2009, he would go over 1,500 days before he played in another NBA game due to a string of knee injuries and surgeries. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Suter, and this is your number one source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. In this series, I'm taking a look at some of the NBA careers that were most influenced by injury, and we've already covered Brandon Roy, and so sorry, Portland fans, but here in the second video, we're going to take a look at Greg Oden. As always, if you enjoy learning about this unique side of sports, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit that thumbs up button if you learned something here, and let's get started. Long before the 3 microfracture surgeries and his ruptured kneecap, Greg Oden actually had a hip injury when he was in just 6th grade. After growing 6 inches in 1 year, he had a hip injury that was described as basically the hip detaching from its socket. Oden went on to have surgery and was left with a right leg that was 8 millimeters shorter than his left. While we don't have a specific diagnosis, one of the most likely possibilities is something called slipped capital femoral epiphysis, or SCFE for short. This is the most common disorder affecting adolescent hips, and in particular occurs whenever somebody goes through a rapid growth spurt, like what happened with Oden. This is, of course, an adult, fully grown hip that we're looking at with our biodigital anatomy tool, and what we're missing is the location of the growth plates, or the physis, as it's called. The ball of the femur here is going to be the epiphysis, and then an area just below the ball of the femur is one of the growth plates whenever our hips are growing when we're young. In people who develop SCFE, there's some weakness at this growth plate, and from all the weight kind of coming down with their growth spurt and sometimes being overweight, you get this shear force that basically causes the ball of the femur to slip forward off of that growth plate, kind of like an ice cream falling off of an ice cream cone. In this hip x-ray, you can see the ball of the femoral head here, and then this translucent line where that growth plate is. But as you can tell, that ball has sort of slipped or fallen off of that growth plate, and oftentimes this requires surgery to put pins in place to basically reestablish it back up on the femur. Because the growth plates involved, one of the complications can be a leg length discrepancy where the bone might not grow the full length. So regardless if this was Oden's exact diagnosis, before even starting high school, he's already got altered biomechanics with an abnormal hip joint, a leg that's longer on one side, and so he's setting himself up with an already questionable foundation of movement. Oden walked with a pretty significant limp, and just after being drafted with the Trailblazers was fitted with a shoe insert to in part try to correct some of that leg length discrepancy, but then unfortunately in the coming months had his first knee surgery. Now, having a good foundation and reliable biomechanics is absolutely crucial for any athlete. And for me, having a reliable foundation with my gear, particularly my computer, is an absolute must for having success as a content creator. That's why I'm excited to have Clean My Mac sponsoring today's video. Clean My Mac is an app that I rely on to help my MacBook run smoothly and effectively, which is extremely important for a content creator like myself who relies on the speed and performance of their equipment. It's a powerful Mac cleaner, speed booster, and health guard to help your Mac run at full throttle again. When a sports injury happens, I rely on my MacBook to be there to help produce quick and effective content to help teach you guys what's going on. Over time, my Mac builds up with unnecessary files, clutter, and a bunch of junk that really slows down that creative process and makes it all more inefficient. But thankfully, I use Clean My Mac to help clear my computer of all the junk and search for all that unnecessary stuff that I don't need. It's going to help you identify all the unwanted stuff on your computer and clear out all that junk that's stored in all those hidden crazy folders that you never know to look. It also looks out for the health of my MacBook by scanning for any potential threats and identifying and taking care of unwanted malware. So head to the link in the description below to download a free trial of Clean My Mac and make sure that you can trust your Mac and rely on it to be as well running as possible. Again, the link is in the description to download your free trial and get started today. So thank you to Clean My Mac for sponsoring today's video and keeping my MacBook in check, and let's get back to our learning. When we think of Greg Oden's injury history, the microfracture surgery is probably the biggest thing that comes to mind. And he had his first one on his right knee before he even played an NBA game. What we're looking at here is a knee that has osteoarthritis, and while this certainly is not what Oden's knee looked like when he had that first surgery, it illustrates the point we're trying to get across. We can get damage to the cartilage, which is that protective lining that goes around our knee joint. Obviously, with osteoarthritis, we have more widespread damage and loss of that cartilage, but also when athletes have traumatic injuries, they can get single focal areas where the cartilage gets damaged. So envision on this model here, if everything but this little hole was nice, healthy cartilage, that's essentially what leads to something like a microfracture procedure. The idea with microfracture is to go in and clean up the edges of the cartilage defect and then poke little holes, essentially fracturing the bone beneath the cartilage. What this does is cause bleeding and induces this healing response that brings in cells that lay down tissue to fill in that space to mimic cartilage as best as possible. We'll talk in a future video about why microfracture has kind of gone out of favor, but at the time, the surgeons felt this was the best option for Oden to specifically treat a cartilage defect. The team commented that his MRI before the injury looked absolutely pristine, and the surgeon commented that everything else looked really good inside the knee as well, but he had about a fingernail-sized defect in the cartilage. But then some of the first concerns from the Trailblazers came as Oden gained around 30 pounds shortly into his rehab. Our body weight is amplified to greater proportions when we talk about the force through our knee, and when you undergo a microfracture surgery, you want to in part limit the load that's being put through that tissue as it's trying to heal in the defect. The team rightfully had some concern about the rapid weight gain, and so there's some thought that that could have played a role in some of the downstream effects. Nevertheless, Oden returned the following season with no real major injuries. But then in December 2009, on this play, Oden simply jumped up off the court and fractured his left kneecap. As he's laying down on the court here, you can see basically where that kneecap has essentially split in half. You can almost make out the contour of his femur underneath it, the lower portion of the kneecap up here, and the remainder of it down by his tibia. So his patella basically split in half from just jumping up off the court. And there wasn't even any contact to his knee. Here as he's jumping up in the air, there's no contact there. Nothing hits his left knee, nothing strikes it. But then even when he's up in the air, we can see him already grabbing at that left knee in pain. Now our patella is a sesamoid bone that helps connect the quadriceps tendon down to the patellar tendon for the quadriceps muscle to ultimately insert down into the tibia. There's two main ways it can fracture. The first is with direct trauma, like a baseball being deflected off of the kneecap. But the second way is whenever somebody contracts their quad muscle on a bent knee, basically pulling the kneecap apart. And that's essentially what happened here with Oden. Here as he goes to jump, in this position he's on a flex knee, he contracts his quadriceps muscles forcefully to jump up, and probably right there in that moment was when that patella split. After this injury, it would be over 1,500 days before Oden came back and played in an NBA game. He underwent a microfracture surgery on his left knee in 2010, and then another microfracture surgery on the left knee in 2012. For Oden, it was just one setback after another. And I don't care who you are, when it's been that long, it's gonna be hard to get back on the court. The more injuries we sustain to that cartilage, the more compromised the joint's going to be, the more potential for pain, swelling, stiffness, and also the fact that he ruptured his kneecap is, I think, the most often overlooked part of his history. When you rupture that kneecap, you can completely change the biomechanics of that joint between the kneecap and the femur, and so for a basketball player, that can be really detrimental. All the focus gets put on the microfracture surgeries, but it wouldn't surprise me if that patellar fracture really played just as big of a role. As we'll review in a future video, one of the big problems with microfracture surgery is that that tissue that fills in that defect is not the same as regular cartilage. It has different biomechanical properties, and it doesn't function as well as the original stuff. So while short-term outcomes were initially pretty good, when we looked at longer-term outcomes, we found that microfracture surgery wasn't as helpful as we originally thought. At the time, the doctors didn't know any different, and so if Oden were around today, I'm sure we'd have different procedures that would have been done to treat those cartilage defects. It's also important to think about the effect of putting in that shoe wedge whenever they tried to correct his leg length discrepancy. Oden had been developing specific biomechanics and gait patterns for his high school, his college, and his middle school career, and then suddenly they insert a shoe wedge that totally changes the way that he runs. We have to be really cautious about doing this because sometimes correcting a leg length can actually induce more problems than it's helping to correct. We'll never be able to say exactly what it was that set everything off, but looking at the history of a hip surgery as a middle schooler that resulted in abnormal biomechanics, and then a series of repeated major knee surgeries, you can understand why things went downhill. The other important thing to talk about with Oden is how much pressure he put on himself and how much it affected his mental well-being. There's plenty of stories where Oden has talked about everything he went through and the struggles he had throughout his career because of all these surgeries. Even if the tissue is fine and you feel okay, that mental aspect of what you're going through is enough to ruin a player's career. As I was researching for the video, I came across so many mentions of how frequently Oden would apologize to the team for having his injuries. While he could have had some small control over some of it, a lot of it was completely out of his control, but Oden clearly put a huge burden on himself. In hindsight, it's easy to say if Oden were around today, things would have gone differently, but sometimes players' bodies just aren't intended for the grind of playing NBA basketball, and things break down and injuries happen and stuff just builds up. I don't know if there's another player who's had such a bad run of luck with surgery after surgery and such a prolonged absence so early in their career. Oden was truly one of a kind on the basketball court, and his medical history was as well. That's it for the video, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it and were able to learn something here. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.